Hello, I am Natalie Nostra. This is Chats with Nat. Thank you again for tuning back in this week. I have fought with myself about what I was going to talk about today. When I started doing this, I really wanted this to be something positive, something inspirational, something motivational, and something that just always kind of felt good. And I've gone back and forth about what I was going to talk about, and was still kind of on the fence this morning. And I went to church, and I sat down in the congregation, and there was a different man speaking today. And he started speaking about the holiday, and it transitioned into the Roman Empire and how the Roman Empire treated Jews. And then it transitioned again into what's going on in our country right now. And he said that he had originally wrote a very warm and fuzzy message for today, but he couldn't bring himself to speak on it because that's not how he felt. And I kind of felt the same way. We are going through things right now in our country that I really hoped would have went away by now. But racism is proving itself to be alive and well. A few years ago, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, I remember my grandmother calling me as I was watching it on TV and watching the verdict, and I was sobbing. And she said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "This incident has brought out so much ugliness in people, so much hatred. And I really hoped that didn't exist anymore. But it does. And it is being played out on our television sets across the country right now as we speak." I couldn't bring myself to talk about a warm, fuzzy feeling today because I don't feel very warm and fuzzy. My heart has been very heavy with what is going on in our nation right now. And it's been going on for a long time. It's being amplified right now, and it's in my face, and I'm sure it's in your face, and it doesn't feel good. So I wanted to do a talk today with a little bit of history for those of us that are unaware or still looking for a reason to deny that racism exists, and start with a talk today about institutionalized racism. The definition of institutionalized racism is any system or inequality based on race. This goes back to about 1968 is where we first started seeing these things used. The Fair Housing Act in 1968 was battling segregation. But even as recently as the 1990s, we have found banks that are giving subprime loans to minorities who are eligible for fair interest prime loans, meaning that the interest rates are higher in an effort to keep them out of the neighborhoods that they don't want them in. In health, the federal response to the AIDS crisis has been markedly slower in minority communities in comparison to Caucasian communities. And they have a giant insensitivity to diversity and an inability, or at least an incompetency in engaging in medical practice with people of different ethnic backgrounds than their own. The criminal justice system could use a video all of its own. So for time's sake, I'm not going to get too far into it. But if you'd like to do some research, I would definitely encourage you to look into that. In criminal justice, possession for crack cocaine is in about 84.5% black. It's 10.3% white and 5.2% Hispanic. In contrast, for powder cocaine, the possession is about 58% white, 27% black, and 15% Hispanic. So Caucasians are more often with powder cocaine, and African Americans are more often with crack cocaine, statistically speaking. However, you will receive a 5-year incarceration sentence for 5 grams of crack cocaine, which is more prominent in the African American community, statistically speaking. However, you will receive 5 years, the same conviction, incarceration, for 500 grams of powder cocaine, which is seen in about 58% of Caucasians. So the scales are very much tipped to favor Caucasians. Again, you could really do a lot of research, and that would require its own video. If you really want to dig deep into the criminal justice system, there's a lot of information there, and all of it supports the fact that institutionalized racism is alive and well. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights and Higher Education Act allowed African Americans into white colleges, and the systematic racism has gone from there. It started really in slavery, which is hundreds of years old. You can argue that they were sold, that they were stolen. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, they were still brought here and forced to work without pay, and murdered and raped and lived horrific, disgusting lives at the hands of the Europeans who were already here. That transitioned into Jim Crow segregation that has a huge, huge impact on relations today between African Americans and police, between African Americans and Caucasian Americans. There was a lot of lynching. There was a lot of houses set on fire. There was a lot of random acts of violence. It was vile. One of the most prominent stories that I remember is the story of Emmett Till, who was a young black boy who was murdered for looking at a white woman. His murderers walked free. We transitioned from Jim Crow segregation into integration with overt racism. Overt meaning kind of loud and obnoxious. So people who use the N-word, different water fountains, different bathrooms, the loud, obnoxious racism. There was still a lot of random acts of violence committed against African Americans that white people that were committing them never got any consequence for. And that transitioned over into integration with covert racism, which was a little bit quieter. So people that were still racist didn't really speak up too much about it, maybe in the comfort of their own home or when they were around their other friends, but it wasn't something that was so publicized anymore. And that's kind of where we've been today. I think that it's gotten smaller and smaller over the years, but it's still where we are today. I know because when I'm around certain Caucasians who don't know my circle of friends, or the people that I love and care about kind of come from all walks. If they don't know that, some of the things that they say and the things that they do are still racist. It happens all over the place. And if you really think about it, a lot of this stuff is still relatively new. I mean, with the 1960s, with the Civil Rights and Higher Education Act, that wasn't that long ago, a little over 50 years ago. It wasn't until 1967 that interracial marriage was legal. So that's just 47 years ago, when you could marry outside your own race. So a lot of this, this institutionalized racism and the systematic racism is a product of hundreds of years of the horrific treatment of African Americans in America, and just 50 years really of integration. So it shouldn't come to any surprise to anyone that we're still struggling with institutionalized and systematic racism, because this is still relatively new in our country. Ferguson, I think, as a result of long-term systematic and institutionalized forms of racism, I'm not going to argue the case, because I believe that the media really butchered any truth that that case may have had. They told us there was an orbital fracture. There wasn't an orbital fracture. They told us that he died 30 feet from the car. He actually died 150 feet from the car. So the media did a really great job of confusing people, and they disseminated a lot of information that was untrue and inaccurate. So I'm not going to argue the case with anyone. That's pointless. But one thing I think we should all be able to agree on is that day, I'm sure that when Darren approached Michael, there was some fear and ignorance that he had about the young, black, very large African-American male that he was approaching. And I'm sure that Mike Brown had a certain amount of fear or ignorance towards the white officer, Darren Wilson. And that's because of institutionalized racism. That's because of the decades and decades of very poor race relations between law enforcement and minorities. Neither one of them was necessarily wrong in their ignorance or in the fear, it just was. And I believe that it was those ignorances and those fears that caused an altercation between these two gentlemen that led to the death of Michael Brown. Now, I stomached a little bit of the Darren Wilson interview on ABC. I couldn't really watch all of it. But one thing that I was sure of was that he still feels justified in what he did. Now, if his story was true, and let's just play devil's advocate for a minute, if his story, every fact that he gave was accurate, he still had other choices, and those other choices were to pull out his taser, to get back in his vehicle, to get his pepper spray, to pull out his baton. There were other non-lethal things that he could have done, but what he chose to do was take kill shots at an 18-year-old male who had just graduated from college, or from high school, and was on his way to college the following week, in case you forgot, because of the way that the media has portrayed Michael Brown. He was on his way to college. Darren still feels justified in his decision that day, which only leads me to one conclusion, and the conclusion is that he sees Mike Brown as less human than he is. He sees Mike Brown as less human than he is, because when you've taken the life of another human being, a certain amount of remorse should come with that. In Staten Island, Eric Gardner was murdered by a Caucasian police officer who deployed a chokehold that he was not supposed to be using, that's banned by NYPD, and took the life of Eric Gardner as he lay begging for air. There is no justice for Eric Gardner. His murderer walks free. There is no justice for his wife. There is no justice for his children. One thing that case has shown me is that beyond the shadow of a doubt, our broken system cannot solve our race issues. The system is broken. So we can request that our officers all wear cameras, which I was very supportive of until the Eric Gardner case, because all of that was caught on camera. Eric wasn't violent. He wasn't resisting. In fact, I never even heard an officer tell him what he was being arrested for. Just kind of seemed like a guy with a chip on his shoulder, if you ask me. But that broken system is not going to solve our race issues, because even with the evidence right in front of them, they still allow the murderer to go free. Recently, 12-year-old Tamir Rice was gunned down by officers who literally drove to the park and got out shooting. There was no talk. There was no attempt to find out what he had. There was no interaction that took place besides kill shots. There was no incapacitation. He never even reached for his taser. He just murdered a 12-year-old boy at a playground with a pellet gun. Children are no longer even off limits. They're shooting first and they're asking questions later. So we sign petitions and we want to pass laws. We want our broken system to solve these issues. But we're not facing the real issue. And the real issues are our ignorance and our fear of one another. Michael Reich in the 1980s had a segmentation theory, it's called. It was an article published by Yale on the role of mass media. The role of mass media has several different goals. To suppress higher wages among the exploited class, to weaken the bargaining power of the working class by splitting it across racial lines, to weaken the bargaining power of the working class by splitting it across racial lines. We're not united. To promote prejudice, to segregate the black community, and to ensure the elite benefit from the creation of stereotypes against the black community. I think there's a few different ways that you can be ignorant or fearful of another ethnicity. One is that you weren't exposed enough, and you develop an ignorance or fear, kind of a bias towards another ethnicity based on your lack of exposure. So you don't have a lot of interaction with them. You don't really know what to think. So who tells you what to think if another ethnicity is not in your community? Well, your TV does. So you turn on your TV and you see Love and Hip Hop. How does that portray African Americans in America? Or you turn on a rap video. How does that portray African Americans in our country? Does it show the exponential rates of college enrollment? No. Does it show the economic advancement over the past 20 years? No. It shows a lot of ignorance. It shows a lot of violence. It has a lot of stereotypical views that have crippled that community, like the overbearing, mouthy black female, or the violent African American male. These forms of entertainment and media are contributing to people's fear and ignorance of other races that they've not been exposed enough to understand that that's horseshit. It's not an accurate portrayal of these groups of people any more than, you know, a bad Caucasian dancer, or, you know, the terrorist Arab, or the very, you know, soft-spoken and mild-mannered Asian. The media portrays these stereotypes, and none of them are accurate. The answer to all of this is very simple, but it has to be done on a grassroots level. We can't expect the broken system who stays in power by maintaining these stereotypes and prejudices to help us solve our race issues, help us solve our ignorance issues, help us solve our fear issues. We can't expect that system that's been put in place to keep us divided to help us solve these issues. You have to face your own ignorance, and you have to face your own fear, and you need to look in the mirror and ask yourself, how are you contributing to the racial divide in America? Have you experienced enough people outside of your own tiny little circle that can give you an idea of how these groups are different and how they're the same? Because we're mostly the same, no matter what color we are. Most of us like to come home to a warm house with a hot meal and cuddle up with the people that we love and maybe have some fun doing it. We're not that different. But we do have some differences, and those differences are okay. And actually those differences are interesting, and they're wonderful, and they're exciting, and you should go experience that. How can you ever get a good balanced perspective on this world if you're only surrounded by people who have had the same experience as you because they're from the same race as you? Go make friends with someone outside of your ethnicity. I make a point to make friends who keep my view of the world balanced, and they can teach me something based on the walk and the life that they've lived. Because, kind of point blank, I can't expect another Italian Sicilian woman to teach me a whole lot about life. We've had the same experience. I'm sure there's a few things that were different, but I can give it to you in a nutshell. We like to cook. We're kind of mouthy. We spend too much money on bags. Like, what's she gonna tell me? There's not much. Who I can gain information from? A Middle Eastern woman. Boy, she can teach me a lot of things that I don't really see that way, because my perspective is skewed as an Italian Sicilian woman about marriage and family. Maybe there's some things that I can learn from her. Or an African American woman who has experienced some of the worst systematic oppression and the hypersexualization and sexism that anyone has ever experienced in this country. Or maybe an Asian man, who came here from another country and has a different way of looking at the world because his culture teaches him to be very cognizant of how his family is taken care of and his commitment to that based on his cultural beliefs. Those are beautiful things. And when we all learn to love each other, you can't stop chaos with more chaos. You can't stop hatred with more hatred. And we can't keep looking the other way, white America. We've got to get in there. We've got to understand that it starts at home, and it needs to be a grassroots effort, because the broken system is not going to fix it for us. We have to teach our children that beauty comes in every shade of the rainbow, and that there's wonderful things to learn from all of their peers, not just the ones that look like them. It's going to start with us. And I hope that you make an effort to really look at yourself and ask yourself, do I have biases? Do I have prejudices? Are there stereotypes in my mind that are really unhealthy and that are inhibiting me from being my best self because I only interact with people that look like me? In a few short years, by about 2040, Caucasian will no longer be the majority. Everything will be a little different then. So I hope that you take the time now to understand how beautiful the world is from different walks of life. Because soon, you're going to be the minority, and you'll get a chance to know what it feels like. So I hope that we all make an effort to really love one another. We're all just spiritual beings having a human experience, and this is just a vehicle to get us from point A to point B. There's no reason that this should still be going on in our country. We're far too educated. We're far too advanced to be still having these issues. I hope that they stop soon, and I hope that you realize that it starts with you. Make an effort today